Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thank you so much for being here with me today. Today, my guest is Jeremy Griffith, and if you're not familiar with Jeremy has covered a wide variety of musical genres, having worked with artists in the worship music scene, such as Kim Walker-Smith, Kari Jobe, and he's also worked with a bunch of heavier bands, such as Norma Jean or Under Oath. And in this episode, we get into a lot of really cool conversation about just the philosophy behind approaching your mix. And we cover everything from session setup, where to start when it comes to your mixes, adding effects to vocals, and he just has this really cool approach to the way he tackles his mixes. And I highly recommend that you check out his Spotify playlist that he has on his website, because it's really interesting when you listen to the music that he works on. You know, most people tend to have a specific sound for a genre, but when you listen to his mixes, he has this way of making every artist, no matter what genre they're in, they all sound unique. And he has just this really amazing ability to craft the vocal effects and craft the ambience of all of these tracks. And that is definitely a topic that we get into inside of this interview. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Jeremy Griffith, thank you so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. How are you today, man?
I'm doing really well. Thank you.
Awesome. For people who might not know your story and how you ultimately got into music and production and mixing and engineering, can you give us that background?
Yeah, I think I was like a lot of producers and mixers that I was in a band, and I was always in bands for years. And after your band ends, you know, you're too afraid to enter the real world and get a normal job, so you're automatically a producer or something. But throughout high school and everything, I was always very, very interested in recording. And it had always been a part of my life. I just never had the ability to do it like people do now. Like when I was in high school, which was the 90s, you know, there weren't a lot of home options to learn how to record. You had to go to a major studio or something. But I figured it out. I started with a couple Walkmans, if you know what a Walkman is.
Oh, yeah.
And a mixer from my church that I stole. And I would do the record on a tape and then play that tape back through the mixer, play along with it to a new Walkman. And that was really fun until about the third time passing it back through, and you're like, I'm out of tune. I don't understand. It's because the Walkmans ran at different speeds. So I would always be out of tune, and I never understood why, and it was really annoying. And then I actually found a 4-track reel-to-reel in my parents' garage, which is really strange. I didn't know this until I was well into my like recording career, but albums used to come out on reel-to-reel tape, and I thought that was very interesting. And that people, I did start to remember like my friends' grandparents would have like a 2-track reel-to-reel player. And I would just be like, why the hell do they have that? Like, I understood records and tapes and then CDs, you know, but a reel-to-reel was kind of wild until I started talking one day with my uncle who had this massive R&B collection. And I realized he had 2 reel-to-reel tape decks. And then I was like, oh, we have one in the garage too. But for some reason, my parents bought one that was a 4-track overdubbing reel-to-reel. Why did they buy that? Why in the world they have that? So that was my first experience with like true overdubbing. It didn't sound good, I'm sure the tape machine sounds great. I still have it. It's in the back of my studio. I'll never get rid of it. But that was the first time I could do overdubbing in time and in tune. So
a little better than the Walkman.
Yeah, the Walkmans are really cool though. Like, I bet you now those little yellow Walkmans are like valuable and vintage.
Oh yeah, some like Urban Outfitter stores selling them for like $200 a piece or something like that, you know.
Guaranteed. But that's kind of like the long story short. You know, you do a band and you just don't want to enter the real world, so you just keep, you know, trying to work with music. And my band, I had a lot of people that loved my band, and they just wanted me to help them with their music. So that's kind of how I kept it going. But it took a very long time. It was really hard.
So were you that guy in the band that was like recording your demos and that kind of thing, or were you guys going to studios for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I remember I did the natural progression where I went from my 4-track reel to reel to I think I got an 8-track mini disc. Like I remember the mini disc dropped and it was like, oh my God, I could do this at home. And it had like a 2-band EQ or something. And then I used that for a bit and then they dropped like a 16-track mini disc. And I'm like, holy crap, look at that. And they were so expensive. And then I remember one day my local music store, they like knew me by name because I was in there every day. I was probably the worst. Like, oh, Jeremy's here. He's playing Inner Sandman in the back or something. And they were like, dude, check this out. This is a converter thing for your computer. So you just plug it in and then it goes into your computer. And so I talked my mom into helping me buy this converter. And then I like put a computer like a HP on a credit card. So stupid because they were so expensive, like for the worst computer. I mean, I think I spent like $4,500 on the worst computer, but that's how I made it into using a computer. And my first software was Cubase because it came with that interface.
Nice. Well, at least Cubase was one that you could consistently work with for life. A lot of people started off with like Cool Edit Pro or something like that,
Fruity Loops. I felt like
Fruity Loops was another big one.
Yeah. Cubase was really great because they gave you so much shit out of the gate. Like channel strips or compressors or even some reverb or something, back then that just didn't have a lot. But yeah, I kind of abandoned Cubase a few years after that and recently actually picked up Cubase Pro again, and I'm honestly really blown away by it.
Yeah. Is it your main DAW these days, or are you in like Pro Tools or something? Or
I'm Pro Tools HD.
Yeah.
But I bought Cubase because I was like, I want to see what this is about. I've worked on quite a few films now that I've done the music for, and seems like the industry standard for films is Cubase, and I wanted to know why, so I bought it. And it's incredible, but my brain just couldn't shift. I don't have time, to spend, I don't know, a couple hours a night to learn this new DAW, and it messed with my like ability to be efficient in Pro Tools. So I know I definitely have friends out there who can rock like 3 different DAWs, and it's like no big deal. But for me, I don't have that ability.
It's a lot of brain power to remember all of the commands and navigation
and Cubase
menus
is
and stuff.
So deep, like too deep. You can do things that you shouldn't be able to do, and there are things about Cubase I wish Pro Tools would apply, but can't have it all.
That's the thing with all of those programs is they are very deep, and it all comes down to how you use them. Like I remember I used to work in audio post-production and like doing a lot of film mixing and stuff, and when I got in that world, I was like, holy shit, everyone's using Pro Tools in a completely different way than I'm used to with music. Like so many little hidden menus and all sorts of stuff, and it was like, this is interesting. There's a whole a whole new world, right? So I imagine that to actually like really get good at every DAW or like multiple DAWs, it's just that's a lot to take in.
I will say, and I skipped a lot about like my history of recording, but I did after those little workstations, I did start working at a studio in St. Augustine, Florida that was like all analog. So I got like a full education on tape and consoles. And I did a lot of records there, and I really learned how to record and really hone those skills on those consoles. So the thing I've always thought about Pro Tools is that it's a little bit more like an actual console. It's set up very much for audio, in my opinion, as far as, hey, we're here to treat audio. We're not, I don't know. I don't know, like the other programs to me are just like very conducive to like being creative, where Pro Tools, it can be, and I've learned how to do it, but you jump into Cubase and you're immediately like, holy crap, I don't even know how that happened. You know what I mean? And it's just an interesting an interesting thing. My brain needed Pro Tools because it looked like a console to me. So
Yeah. So as far as like using your software like a console, like what do you mean by that? Like how could someone treat their sessions a little more like a console?
Well, I grew up on a very limited, like, track count, basically, in this studio. Like, the primary console that was there when I was there was a Trident B,
Cool.
80B. And I think it was a 40-channel console. It was big. And I set up Pro Tools the way that Trident, like, kind of taught me how to do signal flow. So it's left to right, master section's on the right. So no matter what, still to this day, my master section in Pro Tools is on the right. And my effects and my buses and everything are on the right. And I just set it up the way we would track on this console. And I'm still that way to this day, like the way he taught me, like, kick drum is first, snares, so forth, bass, guitars, blah, 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 blah. I still set it up that way, and I can't change it. I've definitely done some different things with busing and now folders with Pro Tools and all these things. But I just wanted it to mirror that signal flow I learned about when I first started, because that was the first time I ever made good recordings.
That makes sense, though. It's like once you've figured out your workflow and the way you like your tracks laid out, it just becomes one less decision that you have to make. You're not trying to find the tracks and, where did I put that kick drum or where's that guitar track or whatever. Like, where things are supposed to be. So that's just like, that makes you work faster because instinctively you can go to the things you need. Whereas like, if you're just changing it up every single time, you're just slowing yourself down really at the end of the day, because you're adding more work to yourself.
That took me so long to figure out. Everything was such a wreck, like in my DAW when I first started it out. Like, that was the brilliance of tape. It's like 1-to-1. If you have a 24-track tape machine, that's it. And so 1 goes to 1, 2 goes to 2, 3 goes to 3. And, there's not a lot of ways to get confused other than just keeping track of what's on the tape. And that in itself is really difficult. Where with Pro Tools or any of these DAWs, you can do anything in the, when I first started getting into Pro Tools, I was lost. Like, there was stuff just playing that I couldn't see and just all this crap. So it took me a really long time to figure out how to transfer over that stuff I learned on the console to Pro Tools, just because it was unlimited, really. Even though when I first started out with Pro Tools, it was Pro Tools LE, which was 32 tracks. But the idea that you have all these tools on each channel, you could route it any way you wanted. That stuff was just like, oh my God, I don't have any clue what to do here. So
yeah,
I don't know. It's an interesting process converting to DAWs from consoles, but I just needed it to look like a console.
Fair, yeah. Do you find that I know some people with their software, they'll follow a similar approach where they want it to look like their console, but they'll even limit themselves to how many tracks. Like, I think like Crystal Lord Algae always has like 48 tracks or something like that. Like, do you do anything like that yourself, or is it just kind of like however many tracks there are, that's fine, but you just have it laid out a specific way?
Well, someone like CLA can do what he wants. Like, people don't really argue with Chris Lord Algae. Or like Tom Elmhurst. I love Tom Elmhurst. People like that, they can kind of do what they want, and people are afraid of them. Now, I do try to implement some of that. I try to commit. I try to communicate with the client as much as I can. Like, hey, anything you can commit. Like, not just tuning, but it's funny. Like, the further I've gotten into my career, the higher the level of client. And the higher it gets, the more they commit, and I love the committing, So when I first started out, people would be like, I would send them a mix or something. And they'd be like, hey man, something's like really wrong. And I'd be like, well, what's wrong? And they're like, well, the drums, they're not filtered through the verses and all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, well, are they supposed to be? And they were like, yeah, man. I'm like, well, they weren't filtered in the session or whatever. And they're like, oh, well, we took all that off. We thought you would do it better. I'm like, I've never heard the song. Like, so I do feel like lately people are committing a lot, and it's making it easier. But like I was saying, like stuff like folders and all that has made it where I can have a 300 track session and it look like 8.
True.
And that's really powerful these days because I do kind of understand where those guys are coming from. I want less on my screen. I always make better moves and my mixes always come out better. So yeah, the folder thing has kind of changed the whole deal because it's in there, but on my screen it's really condensed. So, but someone like CLA and even Elmhurst, they're still mixing on the console, and
that's probably why they restrict their track count as well, right? Because they are limited to that. They may have 300 sessions 300 tracks in their session, but then they're narrowing it down because they only have the 48 channels on the board or that kind of thing.
CLA seems to have such a system, like there's only one system. This is how it's going to go through, period. Like, you watch those videos of him making moves and changing EQs, and I'm sure that's truthful, but he kind of mixes the same song over and over, and he has everything ready to go. So I'm sure they lay it out in a way that it's really quick to make an incredible mix. So I have found that with my own mixing and producing that I don't love templates. I love presets. So I love when they started offering people in Pro Tools to be able to make like recall presets. So basically I could save a set of vocal effects, and I went in there and I started making just piles of different combinations of vocal effects. I loved that. I loved different, presets of master buses because I use a ton of master buses like in my mixes, and I find myself doing that more. Once I get into the song, I listen to the rough. I'm like, oh, I'm going to try this first preset of vocal effects. Boom. Stuff like that, rather than being like, all right, here's my template, drop it in. All right, my mix is done. I just don't want to do it.
Yeah.
I've watched some videos of guys doing that. Like I watched one on the, Ultimate Recording Academy, URM. That's like a metal one. And they actually interviewed this country guy, and he was great. But he literally can mix a song in like 10 minutes because he would drop his files in and just be like, play, and it would play. And I'm like, that's amazing. But also I hate that so much. Like, hats off to him to be able to make this template that kind of works on most country music. But I don't want to do that. So
I guess it's one of those things where when you're known for a specific sound, people expect it. So you can have those
Sure.
templates to get that kind of sound, right?
Yeah, I mean, but that maybe that plays into my career and what I've really wanted to do with what people think of my records, because I've even had people tell me that I'm not as successful as I could be because I'm not pigeonholed. And I'm like, well, I just don't want to do, I want to work with all the genres. Like, I want to know how you guys make music in all these different genres. I don't want to be just a template guy. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to, those guys who template are incredible. Like, they're spitting out incredible stuff, but I get really excited about the idea of doing something a little differently now. When before it could only be kind of like a console, but with the evolution of my career, it's really fun to hear things happening in a new way.
For sure. Well, that's interesting because you brought up a couple points that I wanted to ask you about, and one of them is the fact that you do work on a lot of different genres of music. I think that like you've done everything from like acoustic stuff, pop stuff, metal stuff, like all that stuff. So a lot of people do tend to narrow down their focus and tend to focus on one genre. Like, was that always the case for you, that you worked in lots of different genres, or did you start in one genre and think that was going to be it and then eventually expand, or how did that all play out?
Well, I definitely thought I was going to be some like monster rock producer. And I realized that I kind of couldn't handle the fatigue of recording rock all the time, because I've done tons of metal and rock, and it's awesome. I love working on it, but the fatigue of it is real. It's hard, but I think at the beginning, a lot of the different genre stuff was because I was afraid to say no to a job, So like I got involved with Christian music, not because I liked Christian music, but because somebody heard a record I did and they were like, we think this would apply to this album we're doing. So they hired me to mix this album, and then it blew up, and then I started mixing all this Christian music, and then one day I was like, oh my God, I don't want to be a Christian music mixer guy only, because that really does happen to those mixers, and those guys are really, really good. Really good. But they get trapped. And so I found myself taking financial losses to take risk with different kind of artists that wouldn't normally hire me, like offering my services for very low or free, to be like, I just want to be a part of what you're doing. And every time I've done that, it turned into a new like avenue of work in a different direction. You know, you have to take risk, big risk, to get to do different kinds of music. I even found myself at times almost begging, like, God, I want to mix your song so bad. And eventually they would just be like, all right, fine, and send it to me, and I'd freaking destroy it. And they'd be like, we want you to do the album. You know what I mean? So it's, you know, I think a lot of my genre stuff was fear of not being stuck, or fear of being stuck in a certain genre. But yeah, I mean, I'm just so interested in all kinds of music too. Like, I really just want to know how they're made. Like, even like, I feel like hip hop and rap gets kind of a bad name for production or something, but that shit is crazy. Like,
you can have fun with it.
It's just insane what they do with some of that stuff. Like, they push the limits of what sounds good. You know, like the way they handle 808s and stuff is incredible. Like, you turn it on in my truck. I'll turn on a hip hop song in my truck, and I'm just like, I don't have any clue how they made it hit so hard, and it sounds distorted, and I like it. And how they do that, I got to figure it out. So, you know, I think there's general curiosity about the genres and just fear, if that answers your question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it is really important to, especially early on, like some people do want to niche down and find that genre that they prefer to work in. But I do think it's really important to get a taste of different genres and to learn how to work in different sort of situations, because you learn different techniques. You know, it forces you to listen to things differently. Like when you talk about like hip hop and that kind of thing, it's like, how the hell did they get the low end to sound so big yet so clear and not distorting or overloading, that kind of thing. So it's like you start to pay attention to those details. And then maybe in rock music, you're starting to pay attention to things like saturation a little bit more. And then you're kind of finding where you can use some of these different techniques and apply them to whatever genre you're working in. And that's ultimately going to give you a unique kind of creative sound.
What's interesting to me about it are how much closer the genres are than they sound.
True.
You know, like I was telling this guy at a big Christian label one time, I go, you know, mixing this Christian music is like mixing metal. And they're just like, what do you mean? No, it's not. I'm like, yes, it is. It's the same. You guys want stuff just as extreme. Like, you want your, you know, like, especially in like worship music, they want kicks and snares so incredibly dominating. And I'm like, that right there, that is like pure metal. You want your low end insane. You want to be able to hear this wall of sound at all times. You want the loudest vocal ever with perfect effects. And, you know, it's like, that's the same as metal. And it's been interesting to me how I can apply, like you just said, things from different genres to each other, and how useful that is to know how to do all those, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And like, I always think that to myself, it's like, I get typically pigeonholed as a bit of a like punk producer. Like I love working on that stuff. So, you know, whatever, I'll keep working on it. But every now and then I think to myself, like, oh man, it would be so much fun to like mix a country song or something like that. Like, I think there's a lot of similarities between what I do with the punk stuff to what's in country music, or even metal has a lot of crossover with a lot of the new country stuff too, you know? So there's just so many ways you can fuse these different genres.
I think it's really powerful to, you know, well, I've met a few people who love the genre they work in. Like my friend Bo Burchell. Do you know Bo Burchell?
Yeah.
You got to have Bo on here. But Bo,
I'd love to have him on.
He would love to be on it. But Bo, he and I talk every single day, and I'm always he does a lot of like really heavy bands, and I'm just like, man, I just don't have the energy or like the stamina. And he's like, oh, I love it. I just love listening to it all day. And I'm like, man, that's amazing. Like, he literally is happy every time I talk to him. Man, you got to hear this. This is insane. And so some people, man, they just find their genres and they just kill it, man. And they do get pigeonholed, and they don't care. They love it. And I think that's really cool too, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I guess like, one way to look at it is you get to listen to music you enjoy all day long. So, it's better than working on stuff that you can't stand,
Maybe I don't like music. Maybe that's the problem. I don't know.
Well, it's kind of funny because in a way, like being an audio engineer, you do need to learn to be able to tune certain things out to some degree,
Absolutely.
Like you're focused on the music in a completely different way than anyone else who's just listening to these tracks. Like, my wife doesn't listen to music the same way I do. I can find value in everything I listen to, even if it's something that normally like I wouldn't turn on myself. I'll find that value. I'll find that cool effect that they're using or that kind of thing. So
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel really lucky. Like, I'd say the last between 5 and 8 years, 90% of the music that comes through my studio, I really like it. Like, I feel so lucky to be working with this level of artists that, everyone's kind of awesome. Like, they're really good. Maybe, they're only good at the thing they do, but they're really good at that one thing. And it's really cool to be able to work on stuff that has so much conviction behind it and is just really good and really awesome to listen to. It's way more inspiring when you're working on it, So
of course. And it's also interesting too because you said earlier that people tend to commit a lot more as your career has grown and the quality of artists that you've worked with has grown. People are committing more, and I think that helps because you're also getting people who are confident in their decisions and they've established the sound that they want, and they know that kind of stuff, so they're building it into the track so that like they're protecting their sound to some degree, whereas
Totally.
like some amateur or like younger artists who have never been in the studio, they're kind of like, I don't know what makes things sound good, so like let's just pass it all off to the engineer to guess at what to do, and meanwhile they've got this whole vision for themselves that they just haven't told you, right? So
I've been mixing lately, or for the past year or so, for this label out of New York called 88 Rising, which is I guess it's a Asian hip hop pop label.
Cool.
But literally every single track I get from them, I'm like, this is incredible. And I love how, like, my first mix for them was this artist named Jackson Wang, who I didn't know about. And then I looked him up and he is massive. And I had no clue. Like, we're talking about artists that have like 1 billion streams. For real. Like, I mixed this other girl for them named Nikki. 1 billion streams. But I remember I was mixing this song, and it's a really cool lesson, actually, how I even got involved with 88 Rising, because, gosh, 15 years ago or something, I was engineering this record for my friend John Duke, and the keyboard player in the project, his name was Max, and we got along. He was really just the nicest guy. The whole crew was a nice crew, and we just talked a bunch, and we were friends like you do when you do a session, and you don't think anything of it. All right, well, pan to a year ago, I get a text message from Max. He's like, hey, man, it's Max Mitchell. Been following you for a long time. I have a song I would just love for you to work on. And I was like, oh, my God, Max, how you been? Blah, blah, blah. And he sends me over this track, and I made the mistake of not listening to the rough first. But I do that. I find myself doing that a lot, like just kind of getting into it, and him being like, hey, man, it's a pop track, but, live drums, real instruments and stuff. And I'm like, cool. So I start getting the song together and it's going, and I text Max and I'm like, hey, man, not trying to be weird. This song is incredible. Like, what is this? And everything about it, it's amazing. And like the production is just off the chain. Like, it's so good. The playing is so good. And he's like, oh, it's this artist named Jackson Wang, and yeah, he does really well. And so then immediately I look him up, and I'm like, oh, he's massive. And so I mix this song, and it turns out great. And honestly, I send him the mix, and he's like, this sounds incredible. But, the production and the tracks were so good. It's like literally anyone could have mixed it, and they would have gotten that response. And I don't know. It's just like a great lesson, on having a good relationship with somebody from 15 years ago that turns into this whole year's worth of work. Like, I'm almost mixing for them exclusively now. It's like every week.
Crazy.
Hey, man, we have 8 more songs for X, Y, and Z. And I'm just like, oh, okay. Like, this is amazing. And it's been like one of the greatest projects I've worked on ever, but it's a great lesson on having a good relationship, but it's also a great lesson on when the production is hot, you're going to look good. Now, that being said, there have been countless productions I've had to quote unquote save, which I have. And there have been some also that they were like, can you help it? And I'm like, I don't think so. Like, this is pretty bad. But I also think we're in an interesting time in music where recordings or what's considered a good recording has changed. And that's something I'm actually kind of excited about. Like, I use this as an example when Bon Iver's self-titled album dropped, the big one, the second one. To me, it was like one of the first massive records, like universally massive records that didn't sound like anything else happening on the radio or that was popular, because truly it's like a lo-fi record. Mm-hmm. And there were other people too, obviously there's been tons of people to make, not these like perfect sounding like active rock records or something, but I don't know. I really felt a shift in what was accepted after he started winning Grammys for that album, because then you started to see that, man, if the song is really good, we can present this in so many different ways, where before it was definitely like, this just isn't good enough. This isn't good enough. Blah, 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 blah. Think about the countless amount of songs we've missed out on just because the production wasn't deemed good enough or something, So I think we're in a really cool spot because now there's so many different types of sounds coming out that I'm like, shit, I love that. No clue what they did. And, it might be a kid in his bedroom with a laptop. One of my favorite records ever is made on a laptop. It's this guy named Burial. And it's like dance, shuffled dance music. I don't even understand what he's doing. And I read all the stuff about it, and he didn't use the grid. And it sounds so great, but kind of awful and amazing. And I think it's really interesting that we're in a time where, there's a lot more acceptance about what is good. And I think that's a really cool thing.
For sure. Well, yeah, it's becoming more about the songs and not necessarily about the standard to some degree,
But don't get me wrong. There are recordings happening right now that are the greatest thing I've ever heard. But I just think it's so cool that, there's a lot of different levels of acceptance now. And I think it's an amazing thing.
But I think that's important to bring up as well, because music has always kind of followed certain trends, and it's always kind of been that when a song goes big, that everyone's like, oh, I got to make something that's kind of in that same sort of sound, or so sure. There's always been a little bit of like crossover that way. But yeah, I think to your point, like people are experimenting a lot more, and they're kind of like the fact that we can have songs that sound lo-fi that are becoming number ones or like just become super popular, like it's really changed that landscape of what a pro mix sounds like. It's not just about having like super tight everything polished, that kind of thing. You can have a little bit of rough edges.
What's interesting about it too, you're totally right. What's interesting about it is that when the home recording thing started going down, I was like, oh my god, this is it, we're all going out of business. Like any guy that's like trying to do it the way I have. But now I'm getting people asking me how to figure out how to make their songs sound like some of those interesting sounding home recordings or something. And that in itself is a really fun challenge too. It's like, I don't know. It's just like it's a really freeing time, and I'm busier than I've ever been. And some of that's home recordings, some of that's, major labels or whatever, so
yeah. It's funny that like you'd mentioned that you're trying to now chase some of these home recording sounds. And I think that's kind of funny and interesting in a way too, because, a lot of us have been trained to think that, the pro studio way is that you do things a certain way. And so that's kind of become our standard, right? Whereas like
sure.
When we're trying to chase after home recordings, often it's people that have no clue or no formal training on this stuff at all. So they're like really just experimenting, trying to get whatever sounds cool to them. And so to then like deconstruct that and try to, figure out what they did, sometimes that's even more challenging.
Well, I think there's a lot of power in accidents, and there's some old recordings I've done where I didn't know what the hell is going on that I go back to and listen to, and I'm like, no clue how I did that. Man, that's cool. That is so cool. It's kind of like my friends who go to music school who, were really great at songwriting, and then they go to music school and they come back and they can't write a song anymore. It's like, they know too much. But yeah, I think, obviously with tools and computers, people can do more than they used to do. And some of that is harmful. Like, I don't know, some of the like cheats of it to me seem a little harmful, but at the same time, there are people making music solely based on samples, and they've done that a lot, but there's, services like Splice and all that stuff. Now there's like genres like lo-fi hip hop. Guess what? It's the coolest shit ever. And it's like a dude in his room who's grabbing samples off Splice and just putting them together in his DAW. And guess what? I love it. I know he didn't come up with she come up with all the recording of it and everything, but I'm really enjoying it. So
yeah,
there's just so much to learn all the time, and I'm like okay with it. Now I do think sometimes with like, especially like really high end pro audio equipment, it's so hard to make a bad recording. Like this Wonder Pre I'm using on this mic, and I have this Tone Lux C37. It's like, if the guitar player is good, there's like no way for me to make it sound shitty like an acoustic guitar player. Like, you know what I mean? You got to work really hard for it to like kind of sound like what's going on in like a bedroom or somebody who had a cheap mic or something. So I think it's really interesting to think about too, that most gear has a purpose. Like even shitty mics. Like I was talking to you before we got on here about these monoprice mics I have. I bought them because they were like $60, and I was like, they're interesting. And Tape Op had done an article about them being the best condenser under $1,000 or something. So I was like, well, of course I'm going to get two of these. They're $60. And I got it here, and I was like, these are cool. This is really cool, So, the biggest thing is about what's going into the microphone, If your source is bad, the microphone sucks. If your source is good, it's an incredible microphone. Amy Winehouse could have sang into a tin can on a string, and you would have been like, wow.
That's true.
God. You know what I mean? So, it's just really interesting.
Totally. I absolutely agree. You had touched on a couple things earlier that I wanted to go back to. You were talking about A, not using templates, and B, working in different genres. And we were talking about how you can kind of fuse those different styles and come up with a unique sound. And one thing that I notice with your mixes that I think you do a really great job with is vocal effects. And after hearing you say that you don't use templates, it kind of clicked with me why this makes sense. But like, you seem to have this great ear for finding the right sounds when it comes to things like, reverbs or delays or harmonizers or whatever. And it just gives every vocal its own unique ambience, which I really dig. And I was wondering, what is your normal approach for deciding what to put on vocals?
Well, that's pretty interesting because I think I'm just in love with vocal effects. Like I lust over reverbs more than most things. Like right now I have this Benson Stereo Tallbird spring reverb. It's in my rack over here. And I try to put that on literally everything just because I think that reverb itself sounds so cool. But I don't know. I kind of want every vocal to feel, and I say this about most music, but I want the vocal to feel like a memory or something. Like, and I feel like I get a lot of that with the effects. And I don't really have like a cut and dry way I'm going to do it, but I definitely enjoy multiple reverbs on a vocal and a lot of modulation. And usually almost every vocal I'm running has a slap delay at all times. You may not be able to hear it, but it's going. But I don't know if I really have a process other than I know I'm going to apply these 4 different things. One being whatever the sound of the vocal is. What's the sound going to be? Is it going to be a dry? Is it going to be a plate verb, a spring verb? What's it going to be? And so I figure that out pretty early on in a mix. And then once I figure out what I like with that, throughout the mix, I'll play with the decay of that verb, or whether or not it needs to be a hall, or you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And then I spend a lot of time on the modulation. Like, do I want to run a chorus? Sometimes I run a phaser on the vocals, sometimes a flanger. I know it sounds like ridiculous, but I'm actually trying to make movement in just the tone. And I think it's an important part of a modern vocal, in my opinion. And then after that, I do a very like effecty delay into verb. I always send a delay into a verb. I think that just makes this like ghostly, like memory sound, like I was talking about. And then a slap delay at the end, just to give it even more depth. But I don't have like, you know, a route I always go. Like I do find myself with stuff like the Benson verb. If I feel like the song can handle the Benson verb, I immediately go to it and I use it. And 90% of the time, if I think it's going to work, it becomes almost the most important thing in the mix is to hear this verb. And so I treat a lot of stuff that way, you know, just kind of decide what I think the sound will be. And I love reverbs. Like it's so fun. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it makes sense that you're experimenting with all of these different things, and to hear all those different, like those 4 different things that you typically add, I think it's interesting. Like, you had mentioned that you typically send a delay into a reverb. Are you also sending any of the other effects into them, or into each other, or are they all kind of their own bus that you normally go to and just have it work independently?
The delay into the reverb I use for moments, like throws or whatever, you know, but I don't know what it is. A long delay into a really long verb just gives, I don't know, this really vast sound that almost creates a pad. And I mean, there will be times that I use that as the verb, but I don't send much other stuff into that long verb other than that delay. And it'll be a heavily modulated delay too, you know, like a very chorusy, you know, warbly delay or something. Memory Man style delay. But yeah, I mean, it just really depends on the song and what the song's doing. But I've just been so lucky in the past 5 to 8 years that like almost every singer I mix, I can do that. You know, I can go above and beyond with the effects, and it's amazing because the vocal is amazing. So I don't know. On the same hand, an amazing vocalist, you can make 100% dry, and you're like, what an amazing vocal. So
it's true.
It really still just comes down to the source, you know?
Yeah.
So, but that's cool you picked up on that, because I really love that.
It was the first thing I noticed when I was like just clicking through your discography. I was like, holy shit, like every vocal sounds different, but they're all really, really cool.
That's cool. That's a compliment for me, man.
No problem, man.
Really
you did it. So as far as you had mentioned like a long reverb tail, do you typically work with longer, like are you trying to sync the reverb times to the tempo of the songs, or do you just kind of like, I know some people do that, some people don't?
No, I'll tell you right now, I don't mind telling the podcast, it's a black hole reverb, like from Eventide. I don't even change it. I open it and I change the like mix, and that's it. And I'm just like, oh my God, that's the sound I want to hear. Like when I'm dying, you know, like it's just amazing. No, I don't sync that stuff or anything. And of course it doesn't work all the time, but
it's a good go-to.
It's just really fun. It's really fun for me to play with, you know, and it completely can change the mix, you know, when you throw that stuff in there. You're immediately like, oh, like if the whole time the artist has thought of the song is presented in a dry way, and then you throw on the most beautiful wide delay verb thing, they might just be like, I'd never heard it like that. This is cool. And it might change things, or I don't know. It's just, I think I'm just so enthralled with that kind of reverb too, that I throw it on everything, and it's like a 50-50 chance of whether or not they're going to like it. So
fair.
But I also do try to really pay attention to what the song needs. Those are just things that I really enjoy and are drawn to.
Yeah. Well, I guess that, that's where you as a producer or as a mixing engineer come in with your creative vision. Like you're hearing it with your experience of knowing all of these different tools, like you can hear the song from a different perspective. And so you can offer that to the band, and by just, experimenting with it, saying, hey, what do you think of this? Like it might send them off on a completely different creative path and give that band its own unique sound to some degree, right?
It's such a comforting thing now too, that, I'd say 95% of the work I get, I'm getting hit up because people like the way those records sound, which in turn means they like the way I hear music. And so when I do my mix, 95% of the time they're like, "Oh, I love it." It's pretty rare now that they're like, "Oh God," unless they just aren't into what I've been doing, and that's like a compliment all in itself when you send off a mix and they're like, "Wow, I never thought of it this way. Oh, this is so great." It's such a neat feeling still after all this time.
So at what point do you start to add your effects into the mix?
Well, early on, I feel like what a lot of people would do, like say it's a rock mix, I would do the drums first, and then bass and guitar. I'm kind of backwards now where I literally will find the primary instrument first, no matter the style of the song, and the vocal, and I start playing with those first. And then, I start bringing up like more of the core instruments. So if it's a rock mix, then I start bringing up kicks and snares and overheads and compare it with the primary instrument and compare it with the vocal to see how they're going to fit and what I want to do with it. And I'd say really early on, vocal stuff is going down. Like it's probably in the first 20% of the mix is me starting to listen to this vocal. And also it helps me determine whether or not it's a good vocal.
Fair.
And I kind of go that route now, if that makes sense. Like bass guitars last,
Interesting.
Because it's like if you turn on your bass guitar and it just totally changes the whole thing, or if you're mixing and you mute your bass and you never hear the bass, it's not in the right spot. So if that makes sense. So.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm assuming too that when you throw a bunch of effects on a vocal and it gives you that ambience or whatever, it then shifts your decisions about what you're going to do with all the other instruments as far as their ambience too, and how you fit it all into the big picture.
Yeah, I mean, there's no like systematic way I go about it, because those effects I might add at the beginning, I might end up taking them off. Like, it's just a way to get into the mix and to like kind of figure out the route I want to go. Now sometimes they're like, hey, this is a very drum heavy, so the drums are the thing, and so of course I'll start on the drums and do it that way. But it's all about just how do I get into my mix, how do I, and I've seen a lot of other like really big mixers talk about that, like Michael Brower. He's like, the hardest part is how do I get into the mix, what is that process? So I definitely try to start with the core instrument and a vocal and then start adding things around it. And I found that it's just very useful. It feels counterproductive when you're doing it, but then all of a sudden you're paying attention and listening in a new way, and you're like, oh shit, I didn't even realize I had gotten here. Like, and your mix starts to come together just mentally.
Yeah.
Where you're like, wow, listen to this. Like, listen to this balance. This is cool. So I found when I shifted it to like main instrument and vocal first that I had more success with what the client was looking for.
Interesting. When you say main instrument and vocal, are you talking about only having those in the mix at the beginning, or are you kind of working from some sort of bed track?
Yeah, like, it's harder with like a heavy band or something because the riffs are crazy and the drums are crazy, so it doesn't apply as much there. But like, say like a solo artist, like a I don't know, a folk artist, of course you're going to start with the acoustic guitar or piano in the vocal, then add everything around there. But sometimes it's hard to identify what the core of the song is, because especially with modern pop production or something, there's like all this like doop, bop, boop, doo-doo-doo, so it's like, whoa.
There's so many different layers that make up that overall sound, right?
yeah, and it's amazing. So I try to work that up first still, and then bring in that vocal just to hear what the song is doing and hear the performance. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. So with all of that experimenting that you can do, because obviously there's so many options out there, how long does it normally take you to finish a mix?
I mean, it just really depends on the song. Some of these pop mixes, feel like I'm done with them in an hour or two. And then some of these big, like a Christian like worship mix, God, a whole day for a song. Because, it's like 200 tracks of audio, and you're just like, well, okay, they sent me 15 pads. All right, cool. Which pad do you want? Just make a blend. I'm like, no, you make a blend, send it back, and then I'll use your blend. But, it just really depends on the track content, how they set it up for me. Do I like the song? Because if I like the song, I'm done quick. It's really funny how that plays into it. But yeah, anywhere from 2 hours to, 6 or 7 hours.
Gotcha. So then how do you know when you're ultimately done with the mix?
That's a really weird thing. And I've talked to a lot of people about that because there's no moment, I feel like there's no defining moment. It's just all of a sudden you're like, that sounds pretty good. Oh. Oh, yeah, yeah. And then you do, you might have to run an errand, so you print it and you go to the truck and you're just like, yeah, oh, hell yeah. You know what I mean? It's like sometimes you're pressed for time and you send it off and hope for the best. And other times it's just, there it is, man. Like, I don't know. I think I'm just so confident in what I'm able to do and the way I hear music that I'll get to a point where I'm just like, that sounds really good. I like that. I know it's not perfect, but that sounds really good. Let me send it to them. Or these days, we use like audio movers, and I send them a link and I'm like, is this correct? And 90% of the time they're like, oh man, this is dead on. This is amazing. Or they'll be like, whoa, this sucks, and I'm just like, cool. But yeah, I think you just get to a spot where you're like, yeah, this sounds good. That sounds really nice. So
yeah, I'm always fascinated by people's processes and especially like the end of it, because so many people have different indications of when they're done with their mix, and so
right.
Yeah, to your point, yeah, sometimes it is just you just ran out of time, or sometimes it's you send it to the band just to check in and see like if you're even close, and then they're like, yep, that sounds finished, let's wrap it up. Like, sometimes it's all over the place.
Never like, yeah, there are definitely times where I'm not like convinced, where it's like, hell yes, I killed this. So those happen, but I'd say, half the time I'm sending it to them being like, this is what you're looking for, right? And they'll be like, oh my God, it sounds amazing. And then literally just hearing those words for them. And then I listen to the mix again and I'm like, oh, hell yeah, this is sick. You know what I mean? Like, I need that shift. So
yeah, sometimes just getting that affirmation that it does sound good. That's all you need. Because then you think about it not from the technical perspective, and instead you're just enjoying the song like they're
totally
hearing it. Yeah,
that's exactly right. I think in the end that insecurity is like, are they going to like how I was hearing it? But you have to have confidence to just be like, this is how I'm hearing it, and this is how I'm going to roll.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I do every time. I'm like, yep, this is what I want. This is what I'm doing. Bang, 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 bang. And I do it. I send it off. Most of the time they love it.
That's awesome. So then in the end, what ultimately makes a great mix for you?
Well, this is a deep answer here, or a deep question. It's weird. It's a really weird question too, because I've definitely heard songs that I hate that I think sound incredible, because I want to answer and say, man, if the song's incredible, the mix is incredible. But it just doesn't apply. I don't know, man. I just want it to feel awesome. I emphasized it earlier, like everything should sound kind of timeless. Like even modern pop, like there are certain pop songs that I hear coming out where I'm like, that one might be around in 20 years. It's got a feel to it that's very timeless. And I think that's just really important. And I don't know if there's a way to determine that or make that happen. I just think it happens naturally for certain songs and certain artists. And then there are things that are extremely temporary, dubstep, you know what I mean? Stuff like that, but I don't think there's a good answer for that, because I like so many different types of sounding records,
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I love these lo-fi things. I love the hi-fi stuff. I like a Meshuggah mix. I like Katy Perry, my wife listened to BTS all the time, and I listened to BTS the other day, and I was like, this sounds incredible. Of course, it was Serban who mixed it. He's,
of course,
the biggest pop mixer ever. But then, there are other things that people love that I'm like, I don't like it. I don't want to hear it. I don't think it sounds good, but I just think there's so many cool ways to make a cool or good mix that there's not a really great way to answer that question.
Fair. Yeah, I mean, it does come down to the song and the combination of, all of the right elements coming together, like the recording, the production, the mixing, all of that stuff has to come together to create something really special.
Yeah, and I think half the time they don't know it's special, or you don't even know it's special.
It's true.
I mean, 90% of the songs that I've done that have had so much success, we didn't know. We were just like, wow, good one. That was fun. Like there's a song by this guy called Old Sea Brigade. He's done really well, but he and I recorded this song called Love Brought Weight like 10 years ago, and it was just him and an acoustic guitar, and we just did it all together, The song has 60 million plays. Like we had no clue, you know what I mean? We were just enjoying it, and it turned out to be this colossal song. We didn't know, you know what I mean? And so, I don't know, there's just a lot of like a lot of life and luck factors that come into making a song have success. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally, man. Totally. Well, Jeremy, I think that's a great spot to wrap up because I think we covered a lot of ground here. And yeah, it's just really interesting to hear your story and your approach to mixing. And having heard more from you, it makes a lot of your mixes make more sense to me. Like just the way you approach it in a very, very cool way. So thank you for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was really fun.
No problem. If people want to learn more about you online or potentially even work with you, like what's the best way for them to do that?
I guess just write me an email. I quit social media because it's the devil, and I just couldn't be a part of it anymore. It was driving me insane. So I have a contact section on my website. They can hit me up there. That's kind of it.
Cool. Yeah, I'll have your links in the show notes as well so people can access that as well.
Cool. And anyone can hit me up anytime and ask me a question. I think it's really fun to talk about this stuff. We're all learning. We're never going to stop learning. Let's do it together.
Awesome. Well, dude, thanks again for taking the time to do this. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.
So that was my interview with Jeremy Griffith, and that was awesome. I love the way he approaches his mixes, and he kind of starts fresh with every single mix, and it definitely makes sense. When you, like I said at the beginning of this episode, every mix of his sounds completely different, and especially when it comes to the vocals. But after having talked with him here, it definitely clicked a little bit in terms of how he's able to get each song to sound different. He starts with his vocals and he shapes the sound just from there, and then that influences everything else that follows. So I just think it's a really refreshing approach, and I highly recommend that you check out his tracks because they sound awesome. So Jeremy, if you're listening to this, thank you so much for taking the time to be on here. Awesome interview, and I hope to have you back on at another time. Now, for you, the listener, I hope that you really enjoyed this, and if you did, definitely make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Also, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com if you haven't done that already. And on the website, one resource that you're definitely going to want to check out is called The Mixing Mindset. This is a book that I put together that shows you all of the steps that go into creating pro mixes from your home studio. And inside, I'll walk you through all of the different tools, the different ways to approach listening to your tracks, and knowing how to dial in settings that will make your song sound the absolute best they can. No using presets. Instead, this is all about customizing settings so that you get the absolute best sound. So definitely check out the book. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and it's available at MasterYourMix.com. And that is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I can't wait to talk to you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@MasterYourMix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.